The next thing I want to do is to send some more data in that request. So we know that to create the user, we not only need the email, but quite often we need like a name and a password. Let's get to send the password first. All right. So we have this user data array in which we're gonna have a password. It doesn't really matter what you put here, it's just for the testing purposes. And then we want to put it into our request. So when we do this, our test will still pass. It's because we're really not doing anything in our controller. We just output the data, and we do not want to output the password out of the JSON API. Okay, and as I mentioned, it would be nice to have it as JSON API format, so we should always keep in mind to send the headers as well. So let's send headers and put them into the request. All right, that should be pretty good. Now we are sending the JSON requests, and then we also putting a password in our request. The next thing we can do is to create something called a sad path test. So this is like a happy path. This is assuming that everything is gonna work. So we provide the right type of data and right headers and everything is fine. Then we expect a correct response. So what can we do about the happy path? Let's copy paste this test and then change it a little bit. So in here you can see I call it should throw validation error. So this is why I want to return the unprocessable entity out of as a status code. And then the thing that is not correct is the password. So when we do like this, we want to make sure that the password is required. So let's make that test run. Here we go. Now we have a red test. It's because we're still returning 201, but we should be returning 422. Let's see what we can do about it. In this example is to actually validate our request that it's requiring the password. So we should go maybe even more than that and require like minimum 6 characters or something like this. So in order to do that, we have to create a request. So let me show you first like how a typical Laravel developer does it. He would go to the controller, and in here he would just validate it in the middle. But I think it's not good because it violates the single responsibility principle, because right now your controller not only deals with setting up the data, but it also deals with validation of the data. And I also think the validator pattern is also a little bit unclean. It's because it needs to know about the object it validates. And this is usually creates a lot of spaghetti code, and it might it might be a problematic. So what we can do is to create a new request that will actually validate that. So what we can do is to, in the same folder, create a request folder and then make a create user request. And in here, in the rules, you're gonna have a password that is required, and it has a minimum 6 characters. So once this is done, we have to link it to our controller, and it's pretty simple. We just have to put it here. Now when I run the test, we are all green. So the next thing is the refactor stage. So we had the red test, now we have a green test, now we can refactor. So when we look at it, we can see a lot of repetition, like the email is repeated and the request headers is repeated. The only thing that's different is the data and the response code. And then in here I also assert some JSON. So what I can do is at least extract this into like a public constant, like a class constant or something like this, or maybe like a private variable. It will be fine for now. So let me extract this, and also the request headers. This is gonna be pretty standard. I can make it here. Okay, and then in here I wanna say this instead. Same as here. And then this I can remove, and the same is here. It's a little bit tiny refactor. It will do for now. So let's cover more cases as I discussed with having a string A, B, C, all the way to 6 characters. So typically you could create a new test case, but it's going to be more difficult to manage eventually, and it's also really dealing with the same kind of error. So I like to keep my future test one test per the status code that I want to be returning. And obviously that means one for happy half, maybe several for the south path. So what we can do is to create something called data provider. The data provider provides the data to your test. So what you can do instead is create a data provider in which I'm going to call invalid user data provider, and it always has to return an array. So I'm returning an array, and now I'm going to feed it with data. So one thing is this one. So notice that it's an array that will have another array inside of it. And the second array represents a single iteration or execution of the test. So, and then first index of this inner array will represent a first parameter in the function. So because I have an array as the whole parameter, because I would like to be returning all this is why I just copy pasted it like this. Now I'm going to add another iteration. Notice I'm adding an array of arrays again, because this will represent the second iteration of my test. And the third, and fourth, and fifth, and one more. Okay. Yeah, so now I need to link it in my test. So what I can do is I can use an annotation called data provider, and then I can say what, and this is invalid data provider. And now I need to represent this as a variable, so I had only one variable, only one index, and then remove this one. And now when I run the tests, sure enough, and you could see for a little while that it runs multiple tests. You can see it ran it 7 times and made 8 assertions. So it's 6 tests here and 1 test here. This starts to look pretty good. The only thing I don't really like in the refactor, what I could do is to reduce this array into something more manageable. Is because scrolling down like this, I mean it's pretty readable, but it's also like bothering. Like if I put the next test, technically I should put it below. It just creates it goes out of hand pretty easily. Okay, so what we can do? Well, we can actually turn that array into something like this. Okay, so what we do here is we want to create a range between 0 and 4, which is elements of array 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, which is 5 elements. And then we can map on each of those elements. And then when we map, we get the index. So that's the number between 0 and 4. And then what we want to do is to return an iteration of each test and also the test data. So let me try put it here for the better readability. Okay, so in here, this is our invalid test data. We want to set the password, of course, and then we want to say that we want to repeat a string A, it doesn't matter what it is, between index and +1. Technically, actually, we could also do 0 based and then do the number 5. Let's have a look. Yeah, so you see we still run the same amount of tests. So because the first string repeat is on the index 0, we don't repeat at all. So we give an empty string, and then we give all the 5 letters. Of course, we repeat the letter A. You could randomize it, or you could do whatever, but it's pretty good here for now. How would the typical implementation of this look like if we were really to save the user in the database? Well, let's head to our controller in the adapters folder, and let's see what I see over and over on the interviews. So people would do something like this. They would use a Laravel eloquent object, which is fine, and then they would use the first or create, which is pretty cool actually. And then they would just pass on the data. So they would take the email from the Slack, and they would also get the password from the request. So far so good. And then they would map and user email And that works. This is pretty fine, but it violates a lot of principles. So, for example, single responsibility. What is the controller doing? It knows how the data is saved in a database. You skip all kinds of layers because this is the first layer. Adapter layer is dealing with the requests. Why would it know anything about the database? And then also, it's really not doing anything in regards for dependency inversion. It's also pretty difficult to test it. What I mean is by unit testing it, you can only like integration test it. So there's a lot of trade-offs doing that. I mean, yes, it works. It's very nice. If you're a cowboy coder, you can go ahead and just do it like this all your career pretty much, and that's gonna be fine. Your boss won't even notice. But I would notice, and we in Copero will definitely notice. And code like this never passes our interview process. It's because it's just dirty and it's difficult to maintain. And if you really want to create like a scalable microservices architecture that deals with hundreds of microservices in a cloud, you cannot do such a thing. So what can you do instead? Well, that's gonna come in the next mini series. So stay tuned.